I would like to introduce the first speaker. So Dr. Nikesh Kotecha has worked in the healthcare space across academia, industry, nonprofit organizations, from basic research and the clinic. He's the head of data science at Stanford Healthcare, building a group to develop and deploy AI-guided models into clinical and operational workflows. Prior to that, he started and led the informatics efforts at the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. And he has also co-founded and built an analytics company around single-cell proteomics and cytometry, Cytobank, part of Danaher Life Sciences. Spent time in building, delivering, and selling analytics solutions across the enterprise, for example, TIBCO Spotfire, and seeded companies at the intersection of AI and healthcare, including Factory HQ. And Dr. Kotecha has a PhD in biomedical informatics from Stanford University and a bachelor's in bioengineering from BU, and is an adjunct professor at Stanford Medicine. It's really an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? All right, thank you so much. That was quite an intro. Really honored to be here. And when Huma asked me to do this, I think the thought is to kind of give you guys a kind of a flavor of what's happening from an AI biomedicine perspective. I'm not going to get into too many technical things, but happy to follow up and talk later on as well. Just 1 second, let me make sure. I guess seeing the slide presentation, just give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, great. And
sorry, I just want to say we do see your PowerPoint page.
I see my PowerPoint. Okay, just that.
And then this is the presenter's view. Perfect, okay. Working well.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. We need some AI to figure this out. So basically, I think what I kind of wanted to do was give you a sense of a little bit about what's been happening in the space over this past year or so, and then tell you a little bit about how we're thinking about things here at Stanford Healthcare. And then, like I said, feel free to follow up. My email's at the end of this. Happy to answer any questions as we go along. Right. And apologies to people in the health space sometimes. I've been trying to kind of figure out how do we get a view of healthcare in one slide or so. So please take this as a very high level view of biomedicine healthcare. A lot of the work we do really kind of comes down to this equation, right? If there's a risk of poor health or something is greater than some threshold, then we're going to do an action, right? If you think about most of the work we do in healthcare and biomedicine, somewhere in this it kind of comes into this equation. And what does that something look like? Usually that something that looks like is you're going to make a set of decisions. You're either going to think about, hey, I know how to treat this person. Let me figure out how to do that. Or I'm going to try and decide whether to treat this person. And then if you think about what that means in the tasks you go through, right, beyond classify, predict, and recommend, is that the columns of information that you're going to look at, right? You might be doing something that's amazing research, thinking about how am I going to treat, this next generation this next rare disease that's not been treated for a long time using some awesome technologies. That might fall kind of in that science column that I have here, right? You can be thinking about, okay, how is this going to look like as I give it to patients? What do the therapeutic doses need to look like? Or you might be thinking about how do I scale that into a large population through a health system or a clinic or in general, and that might be in delivery. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that it's an important way to kind of think about all the pieces that are happening in healthcare and biomedicine. And each of these things have their own incentives, right? So if I'm thinking about it from a science perspective, so my career started in the science, I did my PhD. It was about how do I get the research out? What is that view to kind of get that information in a broader way, drive that next, that next insight. As I went from science to practice, it was really about thinking about, okay, how do we think about getting this into the clinic and what does that look like in terms of next generation clinical studies? How do we think about immunotherapy, et cetera? And then now I'm spending time thinking about, well, I know amazing science is coming. Some of the speakers today are going to speak about some pretty amazing things. How are we going to get it out to our patients? What does that need to look like? And that kind of falls on this side of the category as you go through that. And, I'm written an equation here with AI and other efforts, right? You can do this with models, but the big questions over here are still the same, right? How do we think about the science, practice, or delivery of care, and what box are we working in becomes an important question as we kind of navigate the space. So, I've been in this space for some time now, and if I kind of took a reflection of what's been happening in the last 10 years, I'd kind of say a few different things, right? So in terms of what's changed, we used to talk about supervised approaches and unsupervised approaches, clustering, regressions, et cetera. Now, we're still doing similar things, but we talk about them in terms of predictive and generative AI approaches. Certainly, there's been an amazing work in the data infrastructure standpoint. We can do some amazing things now that we couldn't before. You just take an example of this virtual meeting across time zones. And then the final thing is we have the ability to do quicker feedback loops. And I'm using a health example here, but this is also happening on the lab side as well, right? The idea of having a continuous glucose monitor, which I can make an action on, rather than having to wait to go to the doctor a few months from now and have them do a test, is pretty impressive, right? And I think that this is only the beginning of the types of things if we keep our that frame of mind and reference. What hasn't changed? Stakeholder and incentive alignment, especially if you're sitting in a health system. There's a lot of people that you need to kind of bring to the table and make sure everyone is aligned. Or the task you're doing, again, coming back to that box you're in, is going to have a very different thing, right? If I'm thinking about delivery, operations and efficiency comes in much more than if I'm thinking about my science, right? And both are needed in different ways. And so that's kind of the big thing to keep in mind as we look at it. In terms of AI, I think, again, what's happened over this last year, I'd say, I think GPT-3 is almost a year old now. I think it'll be a year old in about 10 days. So has had quite an effect kind of coming in, and it's been taking a while of how do we communicate and what do we talk about as we look at these approaches. So one way we've been doing work and is kind of I'd say bread and butter of what we call standard AI, ML, et cetera, these predictive or discriminative approaches, where we've looked at the data, we observe and classify patterns, and based on that, we predict the next thing or discriminate the next thing, quote unquote, right? And then this whole idea of generative models, I'm going to call large language models and foundation models in there, is really kind of this piece that's based on how do we learn the concept of the data, right? So the model may never actually ever seen that data, that type of a concept before, that type of data before, but it knows enough to be able to create that image or result from the concept, right? So for any of you guys who have played with Midjourney or DALL-E, kind of know this really well, right? So if I wanted to create an image of a flamingo sitting on top of a skyscraper in the middle of Mexico raining, I can create that image now, and it never had to have existed before in space, right? And that's just something, again, as a very high level from a broad perspective, right? Here's an example of something using DALL-E. I kind of said, give me a Van Gogh style painting of colleagues having dinner at a Walla Walla winery. And again, this never existed before, but it knows enough of the concepts that it can kind of get there. Similarly, you can do this with haikus. So it's not just images, it's also text. And that kind of gives you really this explosion we've seen in the space over this last year, right? Hugging Face, Ability AI, Google, OpenAI, Databricks, et cetera. And right now in the zeitgeist, I'd say generative AI is kind of the name of the game in terms of what people go to whenever they think about AI. And I think over this next year, I'm hoping that adjusts a little bit, because it's not the only thing that's going on in this field. And there's a lot of approaches that have been around for quite a while that are actually just as important or even more important as we kind of get into this new era of AI and biomedicine. So, but for today, I'll kind of focus a little bit on this just because I think that's on everyone's minds for a variety of different reasons. And when people think about generative AI or large language models, usually the approach of how to think about implementing them really kind of comes down to three ways, right? So you're either going to do something which is called prompt engineering or data enriching. And so you will take your OpenAI or your Llama, MedPalm off the shelf, and you will engineer it. You'll ask it questions in different ways, or you will ask it questions and feed it some data at the same time to really kind of get your answer. And that's really like, there's a lot of value and fruit there. That's a lot where a lot of people are right now. I can also take something and fine tune it. So I can take the model weights, keep the architecture the same, not retrain it, but I can adjust them. And that's called fine tuning. And then I can go finally down the road of saying, hey, I'm going to build my own model. So in this case, I'm going to train everything kind of like you would a GPT model, and then be able to train and build your own model. And there are times and places where that is actually really useful. And if you're going to be doing something, I would start with prompt engineering just as a place. You don't need to start and build your own. But as you kind of go down the road of understanding the nuances and understanding the questions you have, you'll probably go into fine tuning and building your own as you go through. The one thing that, is a pretty big thing that you guys have heard in the space is called hallucinations. And these things do exist. So this is an old example now, old in the space as a few months now. So it's pretty crazy. But if you were to go to your ChatGPT 3 and type in what was Isaac Newton's cat name, again, in this case, each time it's different, right? It would tell you, well, Isaac Newton had a cat named Diamond. And if you don't know anything about Isaac Newton, that might sound fine because, sure, he had a cat, that makes sense. But if you actually go and look in the history and literature, he didn't really have a cat, he had a dog named Diamond. And these are the nuances that are important to kind of remember, especially as you start thinking about use cases in biomedicine, because that's where like the nuance on understanding the knowledge is important. And so this is a thing we struggle with a lot, is like, where are our guardrails and how do we think about evaluation, especially as, if you're kind of an incoming med student or a clinician, and you see something, it's going to sound pretty good and you might just take it, but it may not be correct, right? And if you are somewhere that you know enough, is this helping you, or are you spending just as much time trying to verify that this is correct versus doing your work? And so that's a slider that we keep thinking about a lot as we go through and do our work. And the other thing, just to kind of remember, you might just hear about a few language models, but actually there's a lot of activity that's going on. And this is just kind of an evolutionary tree that's really showing you how the space has exploded over this last year, 2 years, in terms of the language models that are out there. One of the things that's kind of got coined at Stanford is really not this idea of a language model, but what's called a foundation model. And the language models are an instance of a foundation model. So if I start thinking of language, not just English or Hindi or Spanish, and I just think of like any symbol vocabulary as a language, I can start kind of using similar approaches to be able to train and look at my data, right? So for example, I can think of the encounters in an EHR of a patient coming in through a health system as a language, as a set of tokens that then I can use in a foundation model instance to be able to do some training and work with it. Again, I'm not going to go into too many details, but hopefully these are available on our blogs. You can go and read them. Again, this field is moving really fast. This may seem like an old article, but the high levels are actually very useful, and there's a bunch of articles kind of coming out of that. And when you think about how to think about implementing all of this, what's really happened, at least at a health system standpoint, is that your stack that you use continues to evolve, right? So certainly you need infrastructure. You need to be able to work with all the data that you have, and you will not stop doing predictive or what we're calling standard ML these days. But what you now have to think about is, how do I bring in one of these base foundational models? And then how is this fusion of generative and predictive going to come in? This development layer is right now an active area of work in the field. And I'm sure between all the talks you're going to hear, everyone has some pretty exciting things they're doing in that space. And just one last slide on kind of where Gen AI right now is, or I just call it AI. Again, ChatGPT 3 came out last year about this time. We've had GPT-4, Hugging Face, Meta did Llama 2. We've had Falcon come out. There was an OpenAI Dev Day a few weeks ago that announced some pretty exciting things with an assistance API. And then just yesterday, OpenAI is moving on from Sam Altman. So if you're not here on Saturday, you're probably somewhere reading an article about that in your favorite feed as you go through. So kind of coming back down to how are we thinking about AI at Stanford Healthcare? And again, the stuff I'm going to talk about, it really kind of focuses on these two boxes right now. There's a ton of stuff going on the science side as well. And I'm sure you'll hear about that from a variety of folks today. And obviously at Stanford, there's also a lot going on there. So, one of the things we continue to ask whenever we're thinking about AI-guided workflows here is really kind of comes down to two questions. And they don't really have anything technical in the back of it. It's just really, how accurate do you need to be with your model? And what is the cost or penalty for being wrong? So if I can, if you're going to ask me that I need to be 99.99% accurate because the penalty of being wrong is so high, that's a useful thing to know, because if I build you a 95% accurate model, it doesn't matter, right? However, there are plenty of places where you're fine with 85% accuracy or 90% accuracy, and you know how to work with that 10% time being wrong. And so that becomes really important as you talk to your stakeholders, because none of these things are going to be fully accurate and they're going to drift over time. And so you want to make sure that you understand those two pieces when you're working with the groups that are there. And if you're going to think about how to scale this at a health system, right, there are kind of three areas that you have to keep in mind. So there's the building of the models, there's the verifying benefits, and then there's kind of deploying in the health IT systems. I'll start with the deploying the health IT systems. And it really, to kind of do something like this, it takes a village, right? When I'm working across this, even though I'm building a small group of data scientists and data engineers, I can't do my work unless I get all of these groups coming together to help us really kind of get this platform into production. And so it really does take a village to put something like this into production. And we're excited that we have our first versions of our platforms in production, and I kind of really focus on use cases at this point. In terms of verifying benefits, this is, I think, the place where there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and both in the research space as well as in the implementation space. And we spent a lot of time here over these past few years trying to say, okay, what is the value of an AI-guided workflow, and what does that need to look like? And we did it as research first, and now we're operationalizing it. And so we have like about 20 or so papers out there that really kind of have been condensed into this assessment summary we call a FIRM assessment, fair, useful, reliable models. And what that does is it really kind of says, prior to deploying for patient care, can we just make sure we've understood why we're doing this? What is it useful for? How is it going to work? Can we look at the ethics implications around it, and even potential business cases, right? What is the population of patients at Stanford Healthcare that we see that this thing would affect? And then we've also published and put out there a library for usefulness simulation. So if I understand the workflow, can I actually do a utility assessment and tell you how good that workflow looks like from a numeric standpoint? And the reason this is useful is that when you start doing this work, so a lot of the work we did, we're pretty excited about. We did some work around advanced care planning, which was a model to predict 12-month mortality. And the action was to make sure that patients would have this serious illness conversation, because before it would either happen too late, or the only person that could have it was the nurse, was the doctor. And so we built this model, which kind of gave an objective way to say, hey, this patient is, in this bracket of 12-month mortality, make sure they've had a serious illness conversation. And then we put training around it so that it's not just the doctor can have it, but the entire care team can have that conversation. And that's been amazing in the number of serious illness conversations that have happened. And it's been really great that people have had those conversations, and it's not just the doctor, the entire care team is having it. But we just finished a prospective study. And so like on that end, what we're seeing is like, yes, people are having the serious illness care conversations, but the amount of care, the type of care at the end of life has not changed. So in many ways, what we're seeing is like, okay, it's a good news, bad news, right? So it's amazing that we can do this. It's really driving a lot of our operational. But when I've looked at the health impact, it's not as high as we think it is, right? And so as we start thinking about healthcare systems and the pieces, right, this is one of like 500 of those types of things we can do. How do we think about that and bring the right ones in and prospectively be able to understand that? And that's where these assessments can become really useful and helpful. And then I know I'm almost out of time, so just give me 2 seconds. So three pillars have to come together for all of this to work at scale, right? And the build models piece, I think you can Google anything you want and you'll see there's no shortage of papers or models of things kind of coming out. And certainly Stanford is as active on this as everyone else. One of the things I just kind of want to point out is that there are two ways to think about building language models when you're using the EHR, right? So one is kind of the way you would think about it using a ChatGPT style framework where you're using text and interacting with it via, asking questions. But again, that's not the only way to build a model. You can think about patient medical histories as timelines and build a foundation model that may not have a text interface, but can do some pretty powerful things. And those are some of the things we've done and put out there that people are pretty excited about. And we're certainly excited about bringing this into the health system as we move forward. And then finally, what are we going to hear more about over this next year? I think this fusion of predictive and generative AI approaches is going to kind of go like it's going to fuse. I don't think we're going to see the difference. It may not be next year, but over the next 2 years. Right now it's helpful as a mental model. I think we're going to start hearing a lot more about diets. Not that we don't hear enough, but now this idea of data diet is going to come into play, right? We have information diets, we have food diets, we're going to have data diets as we think about this. Certainly the White House executive order is going to have some policy implications and kind of this idea of assurance labs. And then we need to have methods of evaluating LLMs in AI workflows. So we asked ChatGPT to give us a name. That's the name it gave us. I don't know if we'll use it. If you look at the acronyms, it's LIES. So you can spell that out. And thank you. That was my last slide. Really, all this work is not me, but a huge group of people at Stanford that kind of does this together. And I get the privilege of being the spokesperson today to talk about it. So
thank you so much, Nikesh. That was excellent for the first talk, giving an overview of everything. To everybody, if you have any questions, please type in the chat box. I have a couple of questions. One of them is that, as you mentioned, the pace of things happening is very, very fast. And you mentioned in your last slides that what's predicted to happen in the next year. But I was wondering how much of where we are was predicted a few years ago, and how can we extrapolate that to what's going to happen? Because we usually underestimate the amount of change that's going to happen in 10 years, maybe overestimating the things that happen in 1 year. But I wanted to see what is the major change based on our history of changes in the clinical AI.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the way to kind of think about it is, I think the cadence of technology is just going to keep being fast, right? I think, and that's, if you're like in a startup land, right? Do you think about GPT-4 or do you think about GPT-8, right? Because GPT-8 will be here in 3 years, right? I'm just making it up. The challenge is if you're in a large organization, people and process do not move as fast as that technology. And so, even if things are moving fast, you kind of have to kind of figure out how do you align those as you go through. I think, and in some ways, some of these things happen really quick, right? No one anticipated GPT to become as big as it did over this year. And that's been good in how much it's kind of come and moved forward. I think the challenge still is that we're still figuring out how to adjust to it. And so I think that's going to keep happening. I think biomedicine itself has a GPT moment probably coming in the next year or two. And so those things are always going to be there. I think as large organizations, there's two ways you can think about it. You can either say, I want to kind of be part of that exponential curve. And I know that I'm going to do a lot of stuff that is going to either take a lot of resources or starts and stops. Or I can say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to wait for that exponential to get better, to get, stable, and then I'll just go and do it, right? And I think both answers can be fine, but there's the fear of the FOMO part will make people want to dive in, but may not have fully thought it through. We get this a lot right now, so having to do an assessment before putting something out is not a fun thing if you really want to just put something out, but it's important as we're kind of showing, especially as we get some of these prospective trial data back.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And then the other question is that what is the biggest problem right now? Is it the availability of data, a certain clinical data? And if so, what type of clinical data? That, for example, we know that in big data sets, for example, UK Biobank or all of us, we might not have all the parameters for every single individual, but is it a feasible approach to go and find out the missing information, or is it not worth it and it's better to filter out those data points? And what can be done for having better data sets, which is the building like block for all of these models?
Yeah, it's so I think it really is going to depend on some of your use cases, right? So kind of coming down to like, where do you need to be and what is the level of incorrectness, quote unquote, are you seeing in the work you're doing, right? For example, in the biospace, at the end of the day, I'm going to validate whatever I do as an experiment. And so like, even if I'm wrong a little bit, that's fine. You know, I'm not taking what I'm seeing as truth. I'll have to go to the experiment, right? When I'm sitting on the healthcare side and with our clinicians, that's not always the case. We're going to like have to be a little bit more careful. And so we have to kind of think about where that is. The good news is that, you know, the data sources and data sets out there can be really great place to start. And as we have kind of these base models coming out, you can start with even just prompt engineering and RAG approaches, start playing to see what's possible, right? But then I think what's going to happen is, and that's the reason this data diet is going to come in, is like, as you start thinking about how do I, for my task, build a smaller model on top of that base model, like getting that data tuned correctly for that becomes really useful. And then feeding that in is good, right? So you got to remember GPT-3 or 4 has been trained on everything on the internet, right? So that is like every cat video in YouTube is part of this, right? And if I really want to answer a health question, do I need that many cat videos is important, right?
Right.
What's going on.
Thank you. So, thank you so much, Nikesh. Again.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.